Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Waxcast podcast. I am your host, Gavin Wax, and this is episode 9. We're just keep on pumping these things out every day, every week. It's great. I've been enjoying it, and I just want to give everyone some quick updates. The website is now live, waxcastpodcast.com, and you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google, wherever you basically can get podcasts, we're on it. But anyway, without further ado, I want to welcome the guest for this evening. He's a friend of mine, and he's a reporter with Big League Politics. I want to welcome to the program Richard Moorehead. Richard, thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you, brother. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. There's a lot to talk about. It's been a crazy day, crazy few hours, tons of news that I wanted to run down with you. Let's start off with this latest push in essentially Trump's legal strategy, Trump's campaign strategy to push back against the fraud and the electoral shenanigans that took place in 2020. There seems to be a movement going on, not only in contested states or swing states, but even in just other states completely that no one was really talking about, where the Republican Party and other elected officials are sending alternative delegate slates to the Electoral College. I believe it's happened in Arizona, in Georgia, in Michigan, in New Mexico, even Nevada. So it's a few states, Pennsylvania, more than enough states that if these conditional delegates were accepted, it would change the results of the election. I'm hearing that if it goes to Congress and Pence doesn't want to certify it. I mean, if it goes to the Senate and Pence doesn't certify it, it gets bumped to the House, where Republicans have a 27 to 23 delegation advantage. So theoretically, that could be another path to victory. What do you think of all this? Is this nonsense? Is there some validity to it, or are we just giving up our hopes?
I wouldn't quite say it's nonsense, but we have to be honest and say it's very unlikely that these alternate slates of electors are ultimately going to end up being certified as state electors. So I think it was Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all the contested swing states. And so these electors, they will basically be on standby if litigation against pending election results gets overturned. And for that to happen, it would have to be adjudicated at pretty much a state level after the Supreme Court denied the Texas lawsuit suing Pennsylvania and some of the other swing states for their dubious, illegal, and unconstitutional changes to election law before Election Day. So we are kind of in Hail Mary territory at this point with the election challenges, but if they have a strong case, there's still violations of election law to adjudicate. So we'll have to wait and see.
So you're not too hot on it, which I can understand. And, I'm my perspective has essentially been, I'm not going to say it's over until the fat lady sings, the fat lady being Donald Trump. And I'm willing to entertain and explore any path, legal or otherwise, all of them legal, granted, but within the judicial system or through the legislatures or through, this new process of electors, any process that could possibly push back against this fraud. I'm an all of the above type of approach. It does seem that it could be a bit of a far-fetched move. I mean, some other people are, there's obviously the case in Wisconsin where the courts basically said, yes, there was fraud. Yes, this was not done according to the law, according to the Constitution of Wisconsin. But they didn't actually call for any concrete steps to be taken to invalidate certain ballots in Wisconsin. So it was kind of like this 50-50 where they're coming halfway, but they're not giving the whole thing off to be fixed. And a lot of these, based on what you're saying, a lot of these alternative slate delegates would be conditional on where these courts rule, and they don't seem to be ruling in our favor, right?
Yeah, I mean, Giuliani was just saying yesterday that after the Supreme Court denied the Texas lawsuit, that the president's legal team is going to go in for these lawsuits in state courts. So that's going to be their strategy going ahead, like what we saw in New Mexico today, where I think I could be wrong on this, but they're suing the state of New Mexico for absentee ballot drop-off boxes that were not allocated for in New Mexico election law. And so that's apparently, and tomorrow, there's some sort of audit going on in Arizona. I think they're auditing the Dominion voting machines. And we'll see if that ultimately leads to anything. But the path to litigation that alters pending election results would have to go through the states at this point. That seems a lot more likely than going through the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and I mean on the New Mexico thing, I mean that's interesting. I mean, because I've always felt that that's a state that is trending red. There are some positive developments there. The Senate race was pretty close. I mean, there's a lot of things that Republicans, especially with a growing kind of working class coalition that includes many Hispanics, a state like New Mexico and Nevada and the rest of the Southwest, you know, the Rio Grande Valley and Texas as well, are much more in play for Republicans. And I also felt that there was definitely some fraud in a lot of these less talked about states, New Mexico included, Minnesota, New Hampshire, et cetera. Even if it didn't necessarily impact the top level race, the presidential, I think it definitely had some down ballot consequences. So I'm glad that there's some efforts going into New Mexico. But you're from Arizona, and there's a lot of nonsense that's been going on there. I think there's been some weak Republican leadership in Ducey. Kelly Ward seems great. I like her fighting spirit, so I commend her for what she's doing. But you brought up Dominion, and the other big news that came out of today was the audit in the county in Michigan, Antrim, I believe it's pronounced, or Antrim, where they basically showed that there was massive fraud, and the FE, the Federal Election Committee, standard for errors was something like 0.008, and this was 65 point something, which was this massive gap between the two numbers. So it's insane that this could ever have been allowed. And to make matters worse, all the data from the days leading up to the election, the days after the election, all seems to have been deleted manually, but it didn't affect any other period of time that were on these machines, and they go back a few years, even to 2018, et cetera. So there's some shadiness going on, and I guess the way it works is that it goes through some kind of internal process where they validate or they tabulate the ballots, and you kept getting different results, and it was just so grossly manipulated, and it's well beyond the realm of technical failure. Do you think this has any consequences now? Obviously, they timed it to be after certification or right after these electors voted. Do you think that Dominion, that bit of information about the Dominion machines in Michigan, will impact anything in Arizona, other states, or the election at large?
Investigate everything. Be suspicious of everything. I haven't seen any direct evidence that would lead me to think that Dominion, the corporation, altered the election result through the software, but there's a lot of reasons to be suspicious. I mean, you mentioned Antrim County. Antrim County basically drastically incorrectly reported their election results. I think it was reversed like a week after election day. You want to ask why people distrust the pending result of the election? Maybe look at something like Antrim County. Maybe look at Detroit, where you have a truck delivering tens of thousands of ballots, maybe more than that, at 3 a.m. in food bags on election night. The county officials. So when you look at Arizona, really is different than a lot of these Midwestern states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, because Arizona's actually had mail-in ballots for a long time. We've pretty much always had mail-in ballots in Arizona. Michigan, Pennsylvania, I think Wisconsin too, they invented their own mail-in ballot for this election a few months ago, within 6 or 7 months ago, within the coronavirus pandemic. That's a tall order for any state to execute, at a whim, let alone the most competitive, high impact swing states in the presidential election. They need to cross every T and dot every I if they want people to trust their mail-in election system, and they did not.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, we've basically seen the entire electoral system of many states just get completely upended in the last 6 to 7 months, all the safeguards in place, the voter ID laws. I mean, many of these states that you just cited, I know Wisconsin especially, had many very strong state level protections. They had voter ID laws, they had signature verification, they had all these different things that were in place that were actually good processes and good systems that can be not only been completely destroyed under the auspices of the COVID scare, but they've also, like you said, completely recreated this new ballot system. And I do think Arizona is unique because it also, it doesn't have that kind of, I mean, there's Phoenix, et cetera, Maricopa County, whatever, but it doesn't have that like entrenched political, corrupt, kind of old school machine that many of these states have had for generations. I mean, you look at Detroit, you look at Philadelphia, you look at these places. Pittsburgh, they've had a long history of kind of Tammany Hall style machines that have existed there going back maybe 100 years. That doesn't really exist in Arizona, if I'm right. So what's going on in Arizona is sort of unique, like you said. I mean, and it's unfortunate that it's shifting. I mean, do you think Arizona is shifting blue in general, and this was just pushing it over the edge, or do you think this was all just BS?
Oh, of course, Arizona is shifting blue in general. When that gets down to the increase in population in the state, and frankly, people usually moving from blue states and they bring their politics with them. People talk about Texas, where Californians are moving in, people from all over the country are moving in. It's happening big time in Arizona. Arizona traditionally has had much more stringent election verification systems than I think it was in Philadelphia. The Department of Justice just indicted a former congressman for basically running I think it was a ballot harvesting voter fraud. And this dude's going to get some serious prison time. He was basically, it was kind of like, judges. It was municipal judges who were paying him to rig precinct elections for them. And so Giuliani is absolutely correct when he says that Philadelphia does have somewhat of a voter fraud tradition.
Yeah, and it's sad, and I'm glad people are calling it out finally, and it's getting the, being exposed as it needs to be, because I think a lot of people in this country have had this naive view that our elections are without corruption, they're without tampering, but that's just not how this country has worked. I mean, we've historically had it. We've had it for many cycles. It's been part of many elections. This isn't the first presidential election that's been very contested. People have talked about 1960. They've talked about 1876. I mean, there are historical examples. I think this is different in terms of how it's been done, in terms of the technology, in terms of the conditions of the country, but it's certainly not unprecedented. But we're still seeing some crazy stuff going on in this country. I mean, what do you think of some of the other avenues that people have been approaching the fraud with, namely like Sidney Powell and her suits and the Krakens? I mean, some people have dismissed her. Some people have said that this Dominion drop of information now kind of validates many of the things that she was saying about Dominion and Smartmatic. I mean, how do you feel about that whole side of it?
I mean, when she said that Venezuela was like altering Dominion's results, you have to take that with some skepticism. I mean, I would almost prefer if they just focused on the mail-in ballots and really just focused in on that. I think that's just much more credible.
Like the rate of rejection, right? Because, we always looked at the historical analysis and it's like, oh, it's X percent in the past 5 cycles, they've rejected mail-in ballots. And then this year with this massive influx of ballots, that number would it be expected to rise or at least hold steady, and it's dropped. I mean, that factoid alone, if taken to its logical conclusion, would flip many of these races. That's what you would like to focus on?
Yeah, there's so many statistical improprieties, so I think general turnout in the 2020 election is ultimately going to end up being maybe 11% higher than the 2016 election. I think in 2016 it was somewhere around 55%. This time around, we're looking at something around 66.7 up to 67% of eligible voters in the United States voting in the presidential election. That's huge. It's massive. It's maybe happened once or twice in American history. I think when Eisenhower was elected in 1952, there was something like a 10% increase in turnout between 1948 and 52. And before that, you have to go all the way back to the 1876 election of Rutherford Hayes to find an incident where voter turnout rose so much between 2 presidential elections. Right. And it has so much to do with mail-in ballots. So much to do with mail-in ballots that it could be a liability, a vulnerability for fraud. And yeah, people it's only natural that they're going to be suspicious when you have
skeptical,
dramatic statistical, I don't know if I necessarily call that an irregularity, but maybe a statistical oddity.
Certainly. I mean, the fact that you had to go back to 1876 to show that this had happened, if it ever had happened even close to before. I mean, that was also a race that many people thought was stolen from the Democrat Tilden, who apparently seems to have would have been a much better presidential candidate if you look at the historical analysis. But that's a discussion for another day. I also wanted to ask you, I mean, actually, before I move on to that, I mean, what you're saying is 100% correct. I mean, there are so many oddities that have gone on in this election. If you look at the county by county data, if you look at the bellwethers, if you look at the turnout, the bellwethers make no sense. I mean, all the historical benchmarks that we've always used for elections that have held true cycle after cycle have been completely, upended by this election. And I'm willing to accept that some things about this election were going to be different, that we're going to be, setting new precedents. But for everything to be completely upended the way it was, I mean, just looking at what Trump as an incumbent, how much he was able to increase his vote numbers and his vote share, his share among minorities, the numbers he did in many different states, especially states he lost. I'm here in New York, and I mean, he got, close to 44%, which is unheard of. I mean, we haven't had those kind of numbers since like the late 80s. I mean, there's so many different things that you can point to across the country. I mean, you could go to the county by county data in places like Wisconsin and be like, how does he win Kenosha and lose? There's so many different things that people are going to be looking to for years. Trying to explain it. I mean, I know there's a lot of hubris on the left right now who are basically just dismissing it and saying, oh, Trump lost, get over it. And then there's people on the right who are screaming fraud. But even if you take a middle ground approach, I mean, there's so many things that just need to be explained and need to be validated. And I would be very curious to see if they are ever replicated again at this level, because there are certainly, even if you dig through, say, the margin of fraud, there are trends that we're seeing across the country that are going to hold true. I mean, what we saw in the Rio Grande Valley is probably not going to just be completely erased. The Ohio is definitely a safe red state now. Iowa is a safe red state now. I would say Florida is definitely not going to be flipping blue anytime soon. So, I mean, there's definitely some trends that we could take from this that are legitimate, but there's a lot of other stuff that just makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument to be made that statistically this election was so different than previous ones because Biden won with a Democratic coalition that Democrats have never won with before. Like Biden's coalition that he won with was very different than Obama's 2008 coalition that Hillary tried to get and failed. So one of the big reasons why the current results in Arizona are what they are is that Biden did much better with white seniors than Democrats have traditionally done. Say it's fraud, say it's the virus, say it's a lot of different factors, but Biden really bit into the traditional Republican advantage with white seniors, people in their 70s or 80s. They're not so much online, they're not so much participating in political dialogue day in and day out. But let me tell you this, I know some of these people, pretty hardcore conservatives, I'd consider them. And I know at least one or two who actually end up voting for Biden because of the virus. You can disagree with their motives in doing so, but that's what they told me.
That's a fantastic point. I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad you're kind of almost being a devil's advocate, so to speak, because this makes it, it's better for us if we are an ideological movement to actually look at some of these deficiencies, some of these losses, because there were some legitimate losses made. And I agree with you. I think this coalition that he cobbled together was unique. I don't think it'll last again. And we did lose some ground. I think we lost some ground among older whites. I think we may have even lost some ground among some of those Obama Trump voters, many of them working class whites who were more open to Biden than they were, say, Clinton. And, this may be the last cycle they may vote for a Democrat, but they certainly voted this time. And I think a lot of that, did impact the election. If it was still enough to flip it for Biden, I don't know. I think it's also very regionalized, but it certainly had impacts. And I definitely think he did make gains. I'm not going to be a total, partisan hack here. I will say that Biden did make some marginal gains with certain key demographics that are crucial for the Republican coalition. And I would also I would even add on top of that, I would say the Trump campaign did make some mistakes in trying so hard to win over voting blocks that have been traditionally very Democrat, whether it's, the black vote or they didn't even really try for the Hispanic vote. They pushed really hard for the black vote, and they pushed really hard for maybe some non-traditional Republican voters, which I could understand if this was a normal election.
Yeah.
Because if we didn't have the virus, election, I would have said absolutely chip away at their margins because it'll just turn it into a landslide, because that's the electoral math. If you flip a few percentage points from these demographic groups, the Democrat House of Cards collapse because they're so dependent on, say, the black vote.
Yeah.
So it does make sense. The problem is that they never shifted once they saw what was happening with COVID, which, like it or not, was chipping away, as you pointed out, among seniors, among other white voters, and you're bleeding those key votes while still trying to chip away at an increasingly harder to capture demographic that's not going to be as mathematically valuable to you as your base. So I think they were kind of a little scattered there, and they were not, operating most efficiently in terms of how they were out, in terms of their outreach to voters. But still, I still am not fully convinced that these marginal gains that I think were legitimate from Biden were enough to flip the race.
Yeah, there's plenty of reasons to be suspicious. I mean, there was the biggest censorship campaign in American history. People talk about a rigged election. Why don't we? That is this unprecedented American history where you can have major news outlets collude with big tech to shut down a story about a candidate's son doing overseas business dealings, enriching himself to the tunes of millions with the Ukrainian oil company, and
no repercussions.
No repercussions. So. The reality is that, billions of American voters are going to doubt the legitimacy of this election. That's the nature of the game. And when you win with dubious election practices, that's how it works.
Yeah, and I mean, we always have to go forward, factor in fraud, and it has to be part of any campaign strategy. Just to ignore it and be doing all this stuff, last minute, doing all these legal fights last minute, because you're operating under a tight window, which is tight just in general, but it's especially tight, especially when you're talking about litigation and lawsuits and legislatures. So this is stuff that needs to be done beforehand. I mean, they really should have been fighting all these electoral challenges that were being done by executive fiat the last 10 months. I mean, they had their activist lawyers. We should have had our lawyers. But, and what you're saying also is another good point, is that the Democrats on the left, they have absolutely no, they're not really looking at this rationally, because Trump gained, 11 million votes. He still performed exceptionally well, even if you accept these current results at face value. And that was in spite of everything. They had to throw every ounce of their power, their influence against him, from big tech to big media to every institution they can mobilize. They did not waste one bullet in this, this war, which is really what it was. And he still, even with these dubious numbers, still almost won. So if they really think that they have anything of a mandate, if they really think that Trumpism has been repudiated, if they really think that the Republican Party and the conservative center-right silent majority in this country have been defeated, I mean, that is a very, very bad takeaway. Because they barely made it out of this, barely. If they still do, I mean, there's obviously still some time. I mean, do you think that's an accurate analysis?
Yeah, I mean, another takeaway will be that the voters that you think Trump may have lost, that may have proved pivotal in the election outcome, seeming to pivot to Joe Biden, Republicans can easily win those voters back then. Ask anyone who happens to know, white seniors in their 70s or 80s. Those people are not longtime Democrats. That's not going to happen.
Well, until they die, of course, Richard.
Yeah.
Then they'll be longtime Democrats. But
Democrats forever then.
Yes, forever and ever.
It's going to be a lot easier for any Republican, be it Trump, if he ends up running in 2024, or any Republican, to win those voters back. A lot easier than it will be for Democrats to win back, let's say, working class voters in Pennsylvania or Michigan.
Yep, exactly. I mean, the only thing that scares me, I mean, and also, he also won new demographics that are definitely never going to be going back to the plantation, so to speak, or to the Democrat camp. But the only thing that scares me about that whole kind of more traditional view is that what they will be doing the next 4 years, if they have government, even if it's not united government, if they have close to all three branches, is that they will be passing every regressive, and this is also going to be segueing into our next segment about what a Biden presidency will look like. But the next 4 years, if they do succeed, they will pass every rule, law, regulation, everything they can to make it as easy for them to win again and to dominate the American political landscape for at least a generation. I'm talking about, getting in Puerto Rico and DC as states, maybe making other states, mass amnesty, open immigration, open borders, codifying all these loose voting regulations that they imposed temporarily during this election, making those the standard. I mean, every possible thing you think they will do, because the Democrats are ruthless. The Democrats are killers, unlike Republicans, who, when we take power, we do jack diddly squat with it. When we had united government for 2 years, but when we have Obama as precedent, look what they did when the left took over. They did not miss a beat. They passed every one of their agenda items that they wanted. And, it could have really, had Trump not come along, their plan for sort of multi-generational political dominance akin to FDR would have succeeded. Now, I mean, I want to segue this into what the crux of our conversation really wants to be is, what do you view this Biden presidency, regardless of the Senate, or winning the Senate, losing the Senate? I mean, to me, it looks like he's building another neoliberal Obama type cabinet. Which is bad and good, but I'll pass it off to you.
I would say even more so than Obama. I would say what a likely Biden presidency look like would represent the fulfillment of the union of the Democratic Party between all the powerful, corrupt institutions in American society, be it big tech, big corporations, the richest, most powerful people in the country, the most powerful or what I was going to say, the so-called intelligence community. Those are the people who are going to be governing the country.
Yep.
And that's a frightening prospect, but the redeeming factor is that Americans are going to see what they're getting with these swamp forces that have been constantly in opposition to President Trump, in opposition to the Make America Great Again program. They're going to see what they've been missing, and it's not going to be good.
I do think that's a silver lining. I think, these people have operated in the shadows for so long within the deep state apparatus, both under Trump and prior to Trump. And, now that they're center stage again, I mean, there's really no hiding. And then they'll show what they really are, what they really believe in. It's just, generally speaking, this corporatist neoliberal consensus, which is just the most, I could actually, see some left-wing positions and understand the validity in their arguments. I can understand the need for them. I mean, I saw some tweets from Bernie and AOC where they were talking about direct assistance to families and working with, people like Josh Hawley. But you look at the Biden cabinet when Biden's forming, it's just the worst of all worlds. I mean, there doesn't seem to be qualities to anything that they're assembling. And to call it moderate is a joke. I mean, this is not moderate. I mean, they are very much ideological.
Neoliberal corporatists. He's handpicked the cream of the crop of neoliberal corporatists. You look at Alejandro Mayorkas, who he selected for DHS. The guy has multiple reports from the DHS Inspector General accusing him of basically providing cheap labor work visas to companies owned by Democrat establishment politicians. This is when he was the director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He's got people like Tony Blinken, who seems deeply ingratiated with the Washington, D.C. consulting complex. He nominated someone for HUD the other day, and this lady, she's like a Democrat congresswoman. She had written a letter of leniency for this Cleveland judge who actually ended up killing someone. So I wouldn't describe that person as neoliberal corporatist, but that's definitely questionable judgment. You're going to see. I was going to even bring this up. So Biden's presidency, actually, he's bringing a lot of people from the Open Societies Foundation, George Soros' foundation.
Yep.
He's got them working on his transition team. Biden's presidency, I think, actually is going to represent the most influence that George Soros has ever had on the American federal government. Not many people know this, but when Obama was president, George Soros was actually somewhat boxed out of the governing process because he supported Hillary Clinton in 2008. This time, when you look at Biden's personnel picks, that's not going to be the case. He's going to have a lot of left-wing billionaires like Soros. We're going to have an open line to make their policy demands.
That is an interesting tidbit, and people do forget some of the intricacies and the nuances, even within the Democrat left-wing camp, like the one you just illustrated. People tend to think it's good guys, bad guys, but even within these, quote-unquote bad guys, there's a lot of, personal egos and other things that are dividing them. I mean, we really are, as Darren Beatty and Michael Anton have described. I mean, we really are becoming the victim of a color revolution. I mean, this is the same playbook we've seen happen in many other countries across the world, where you have these completely unpopular, completely propped up and artificial, neoliberal corporatist governments take over against the will of the people. And it's absolutely disgusting that we've become a victim to it. I mean, the fact that we are still somewhat of a superpower, or the preeminent superpower, and now we're essentially really becoming beholden to these international interests, to China, to the revolving door, as you described, with the Open Society Foundation. I mean, it's a sad state. It's a really sad state. And if this is what we're going to have for the next 4 years, I mean, our country is in for a lot of hurt, and we're not going to be experiencing anything. If people think it's going to just return to the Obama days, I think those are over. I think the elites and the powers that be in this country are out for blood. They hate that they lost their power for 4 years. They hate how many of their plans and machinations were set back for many years, even more than 4 years, because of Trump's presidency. Because he did do a lot at the end of the day. Obviously, I wish it was worse. It was more, but he was hamstringed in many ways, which is another podcast in and of itself. But they're not going to just go back to, the status quo under Obama, whatever people may have remembered from those times economically, et cetera. I mean, they will be out to radically change society. They may operate as neoliberalists, liberal corporatists, but in many ways, their tactics will be Jacobin in style. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I would say that Biden definitely is. He's going to try to go back to the good old days of governing like it's 2011, 2010. And I ultimately think that's going to backfire. I think that that's just an age that has long since passed, and he's in for a rude awakening if he thinks he's going to go back to an old crony, corporatist way of governing, corporate Democrat. And so I think he's actually going to incur quite a bit of opposition on the left. I think Biden could be the most unpopular president within his own party in a long time.
Interesting.
Yeah, people acted as if it was really crazy that Republicans overwhelmingly supported Trump. That's pretty much normal. Members of a political party always support their sitting president. That's
right.
It's the start of this country.
Right.
If it doesn't end up happening with Biden, which I suspect might be the case, then I think we might be in some interesting, unprecedented political territory. Because he won. You look at how he won. He won through establishment forces in the Democratic Party coalescing around him as an alternative to Sanders.
Right.
You had Buttigieg dropping out. I think that lady from
Klobuchar.
He was saved through a last-minute intervention.
Yep.
He did not win the Democratic primary in a way that Trump won the Republican primary in 2016. He was a last resort.
Yeah, he was a last resort, and he was not anyone who expected to win. I mean, their field was kind of a mess in general, which helped him. But I remember meeting. I actually met his campaign manager at a job I previously worked at, and it was either after New Hampshire or something, really when he was on his last legs. And I remember meeting this guy, and I'm just like, who the hell? Biden is nobody. He's over. He has no shot in hell of winning. And little did I know, gets to South Carolina, which he was expected to do well in anyway. Yeah. It wasn't even South Carolina. South Carolina was his first win, which again was also a historical anomaly, because normally you have to win at least Iowa or New Hampshire. He didn't win either. He didn't do well at all. And then you see just this sort of it wasn't just the establishment coalescing around him, because it wasn't just Klobuchar and Buttigieg dropping out so he consolidated his vote. It was also that the left wing, in terms of Warren and Bernie, also both remained in.
Yeah.
So Warren remaining in almost screwed over Bernie just as much as Buttigieg and Klobuchar were when they dropped out.
Yeah.
And this was all backroom deals. I mean, Obama probably held his nose, but he probably pulled the final trigger to get the forces in work. But he had no popular support within the Democratic primary. His debate performances were atrocious. He wasn't even the best establishment, quote unquote, moderate candidate by a long shot. The only reason they supported him was because he's an empty suit who could be manipulated through, because they have plenty of compromising materials of him, and he's just a corrupt hack to begin with. And two, he is probably the last person in their primary who had those vestiges of the old kind of blue dog Democrat coalition. He's far from that. He's not that old Democrat that existed 30 years ago, but people may still remember him as such, and they may view him as such if they're completely politically illiterate. And that helped him with the groups we mentioned earlier, maybe some older whites and some blue collar whites, which made sense.
I was going to say that I even at the start of the Democratic primary, I knew that one of Biden's strengths as a candidate would be that he would be able to invoke kind of the 20th century, late 20th century style of American politics.
Yeah,
kind of like an affable older guy. He has the power to remind Americans of an era before intense partisan affiliation. And however, it's one thing to remind Americans of it. It's a lot harder to actually return to that political climate. There's so many factors in this country now that make that all but impossible.
Yep.
And Biden thinks he's just going to recreate that by being a nice guy, bumbling uncle. I don't see that happening.
No, this is a new era. This is a new chapter in our country, and that nostalgia effect will only carry him so far, because people will see that he is a phony. They will see that whatever they're reminiscing of a bygone era, and I can understand that, because we have come so far as a nation, and not in a good way, that I can understand a longing for, say, the political dynamics of, the 80s or 70s or 60s. Yeah. Where, the parties were not that far apart. There was a lot more consensus. There was a national consensus.
Identity politics.
Which is entirely a product of the left.
Yeah.
The left turned white Americans into a voting bloc. I mean, Trump accelerated it because he's an accelerationist, as a byproduct of who he is in many regards. But the left, through their politicking of racial divisionism, created identity politics, which so many people find repugnant. But the funny thing about the identity politics is that you live by it, you die by it. So that's why they are still a house of cards when it comes to it, because they're so dependent on a few key demographic groups and this kind of wobbly coalition that you were talking about that backed Biden, that they were all united in their hatred of Trump and their willingness to want to remove Trump at all costs, but they will not be united in any sort of governing vision for America. And that's and it's a lot easier to run a campaign than it is to govern. I mean, when you get to the governing stage, that's where things are going to get a lot dicier and a lot more complicated for Biden. And it doesn't look like his cabinet is necessarily any kind of peace offering to the left. I mean, we even saw BLM going out and be like, "You haven't returned our calls," which I found was hilarious. But what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see which constituencies Biden's going to say, sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you what you want. My suspicion is it's probably going to be the left, looking at how he's handled his transition thus far. I also think there's even a chance that the Project Lincoln losers end up to say, you're not doing anything we want. And that we're definitely not letting them back into the Republican Party. No way about that. So from a political standpoint, that might be the most useful group for Biden to enshrine as the lowest member of his political coalition, because he knows they have no other option. But we'll see.
No, I really like your analysis, because as far as the near-term stuff with the election fraud and the January 20th, you have a healthy level of skepticism while you're still optimistic for the result. But as you view the long-term, politics of the next 4 years, you're actually a lot more positive, which is a unique dynamic. Because when I'm looking on Twitter, it's either the doom and gloom, everything is over, the world is ending, we're all going to end up in camps, which is tongue in cheek half the time, but also funny. Between that and then the people who think Trump's going to be riding on a white horse, and everything is going to save the day, and everything was part of some 4D chess plan. Huh?
There's 2024.
There's 2024. I mean, he's going to be older. I hope he can. I hope he does it, because the rest of the field looks incredibly weak, and we really needed him for. What makes me so sad is that the second term would have been so critical, because all the hiccups of the first term, in terms of personnel, in terms of being naive, in terms of politics, in terms of just not getting your footing right, in terms of the Russiagate strangling them. All of that would have been behind us, and then the 4 years if he wins, or he could have won, would have really been the solidifying Trumpism and this new Republican Party and this new populist nationalist coalition, it would have solidified it, would have institutionalized it, it would have given it a lot more credibility, and it would have been able to become much more effectuated in government. And that's all been pulled out from under us because the first 4 years were essentially lost time in many regards. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was great and it really helped, but it could have been so much more. And what we were looking forward to in a second term would have been even multiples greater. So that's what I'm really depressed about.
Yeah, the old Republican establishment is definitely going to make a go to try and retake the party. That they could not have tried to. That would not be in the cards if Trump had won a second term. That would have no way. But I actually doubt they're going to be successful. I mean, so many of these people have pretty much already taken their place on the left. I mean, you look at the Crystals of the world.
Yeah.
I think some other ones. These people are not. They're not going to be coming back and making policy in the Republican Party. No way or shape about it.
They were so dumb and arrogant. They overplayed their hand, because if they really felt that Trump was this bumbling buffoon who had no political future, they would have moderated the last 4 years. They just went so hard left, so hard into the Democrat camp in order to spike Trump that they have destroyed any possibility for them to weasel their way in. Thankfully, Lincoln Project, Bill Kristol, the neocons, the rhinos. I mean, I think the establishment is toast. I think the grassroots is very aware of what's going on. They're not dumb. They're very cognizant of the fact patterns and of the news and of what the establishment is doing. And Trump was such a fire breather, and he gave so much energy to the grassroots. They could never go back to business as usual. They're going to have to toe some line, some level of Trumpism, no matter what happens. No matter what happens with Trump, no matter what he does, they're going to have to hold that line. Because if they think they're just going to be able to sneak in a Nikki Haley, Dan Crenshaw, and everyone's just going to be like, okay, that sounds good. That is so dumb and so arrogant. And it didn't work in 2016. It's not going to work in 2024.
I would be very surprised. The one question is whether, there are populist leaders. There is no nationalist populist leader that can replace Trump. Like, that's
sadly.
Yeah. I mean, so there are people like Tucker and Hawley. I mean, they both have their merits, pretending that they're going to have the appeal of someone like Donald Trump, who pretty much won the most shocking presidential election victory in American history.
Yep.
I don't really see that. So really the question for kind of America First Republicans is, institutional power within the Republican Party, because I mean that's going to be how the old establishment tries to take back the GOP, and we're going to need a lot more groups like the New York Young Republicans. I think we need one of those in Arizona, man. If we want to keep the Republican Party as a working class, middle class, America First party. So.
Amen, man. And this has been a great podcast. I definitely want to have you on again. This was some great analysis, and covered a lot of ground here. So I want to pass off the last words to you. Please let everyone know where they can follow you, your writing, your social media, etc. And love to have you back on again to hash out more topics.
Absolutely, brother. You guys can find me on Twitter, Wildman at Wildman_AZ. That's my hashtag. You can also find me on Parler. At Moorehead, Moorehead. And man, it's really great to be with you, Gavin. Look forward to the next time, man.
Thank you, man. And keep up the fight in Arizona and with big league politics. You guys do great work. And everyone stay tuned. We're going to have another episode of the Waxcast coming around shortly. So don't go just yet.